The rain had not stopped for hours. Heavy drops hit the hospital windows hard enough to sound like small stones. Outside, the parking lot lights reflected across the wet pavement, turning the empty night into a blur of yellow and gray. Inside the emergency department, the air smelled of coffee, antiseptic, and exhaustion. Veyna adjusted the sleeves of her navy blue scrubs and glanced at the wall clock near the nurse's station. It was already past midnight. The night shift still had 6 long hours left. Most of the staff looked drained. Some sat quietly while entering reports into computers. Others leaned against counters, sipping coffee that had long gone cold. The emergency room had been busy all evening because of the storm. Car accidents, slips on flooded sidewalks, and panic calls had filled nearly every room. Veyna moved through the hallway calmly, carrying a small tray of supplies. Unlike some of the younger nurses, she never rushed unless she absolutely had to. Her quiet way of working often made people think she was distant, but the truth was different. She simply learned years ago that panic spread faster than illness. A patient in room 6 called for help, and she immediately turned toward the voice. "I'll be right there," she said gently. Even after working 12-hour shifts for weeks, her voice still carried patience. That was something people noticed about her. No matter how stressful things became, Veyna rarely raised her voice. An older nurse named Delra watched her from across the hall. "You ever sleep?" she joked softly. Veyna smiled faintly. "Sometimes." Delra shook her head. "You've covered 3 extra shifts this week. One day your body's gonna force you to rest." "Maybe," Veyna replied, but she already knew rest would not come easily. It never really had. Years earlier, before working at the hospital near the coast, Veyna had spent time in places she never fully talked about. Her file only mentioned military medical service overseas. No details, no stories. Whenever curious coworkers asked questions, she politely changed the subject. At first, people thought she was hiding painful memories. Later, they stopped asking. The loudspeaker suddenly cracked above them. "Emergency transport arriving in 4 minutes. Critical condition." The relaxed atmosphere vanished immediately. Doctors stepped out from nearby rooms. Nurses grabbed gloves and fresh equipment. One orderly hurried a stretcher into position near the entrance doors. Veyna placed her tray down and tied her hair back tighter. Storm nights always brought surprises. The automatic doors burst open minutes later as cold wind and rain swept into the hallway. 2 paramedics rushed inside beside a soaked stretcher. Water dripped from their jackets onto the floor. "We've got a male patient, mid-30s, one paramedic shouted while moving quickly. "Found unconscious near the Harbor Warehouse District. Severe breathing distress. Pulse unstable during transport." A doctor walked beside the stretcher immediately. "Any identification?" "Almost nothing. No wallet. Just this bracelet." The patient looked pale beneath the emergency lights. Rainwater still clung to his dark hair and jacket. His chest rose unevenly with each weak breath. Machines began connecting around him as the team pushed him toward Trauma Room 2. Veyna followed closely behind, noticing small details others missed. The man's hands were rough with old scars. His jacket was expensive but worn at the edges. He looked like someone who had traveled far without caring much about himself. Inside the trauma room, tension rose quickly. "Blood pressure dropping," a nurse warned. "Get oxygen higher. Prepare another line." The room filled with movement and overlapping voices. Metal instruments clinked. Monitor alarms pulsed steadily. Veyna stepped near the patient while another nurse attached sensors to his chest. She kept her eyes on the monitor for several seconds without speaking. Something felt wrong. Not simply serious. Different. The patient's breathing pattern shifted strangely every few moments, almost as if his body kept fighting against the treatment itself. Dr. Thalen entered the room, already putting on gloves. He was respected in the hospital for staying calm under pressure, but tonight even he looked tense. "What do we know?" he asked sharply. "Very little," Delra answered. "Found unconscious near the harbor. Vitals unstable." Dr. Thalen checked the monitor. "Possible cardiac issue. Let's move fast." The team worked around him immediately. Veyna stood quietly near the foot of the bed. Her eyes lowered briefly toward the patient's wrist where the metal bracelet remained attached. Rainwater still covered it, but she noticed faint markings engraved along the side. Not a name, not a hospital tag. Codes. Very specific codes. For a second, her expression changed. It happened so quickly nobody else noticed. A younger nurse beside her whispered, "You okay?" Veyna blinked once and nodded. "Fine." But her heartbeat had already quickened. The bracelet looked familiar. Too familiar. Dr. Thalen suddenly looked up. "We're losing rhythm." The monitor's steady pattern became uneven. The room immediately grew louder. "Come on," one nurse muttered under her breath. Veyna stepped closer. The patient's skin color was changing rapidly now. His breathing became shallow. Dr. Thalen gave another order. "Prepare emergency medication." A tray slid across the room. Someone nearly dropped a syringe in the rush. The younger staff members looked nervous. One in turn wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold air. But Veyna's attention stayed fixed on the bracelet. Her mind had already gone somewhere far away. Cold nights, metal tables, training rooms hidden behind locked military doors. Voices repeating the same warning over and over. If this condition appears, standard treatment may fail. She had not thought about those days in years. The memory hit so suddenly that she barely noticed Delra calling her name. "Veyna." No response. "Veyna." She looked up quickly. "Sorry." Delra frowned. "You sure you're all right?" Before Veyna could answer, the patient's monitor let out a sharp warning sound. Dr. Thalen cursed under his breath. No response yet. The room became more intense. Nurses moved faster. Equipment beeped continuously. Veyna stared at the patient again, and something deep inside her twisted painfully. Not fear. Recognition. She stepped toward the bed suddenly. "Wait," she said. Nobody listened at first. "Wait," she repeated louder. Dr. Thalen glanced at her impatiently. "Not now." She looked directly at the patient's bracelet again. Then she spoke words that immediately confused everyone in the room. "You're treating the wrong condition." Silence hit for half a second. The younger in turn looked stunned. Delra frowned in confusion. Dr. Thalen straightened slowly. "Excuse me?" Veyna rarely challenged anyone, especially not publicly. But something in her face had changed completely. She pointed carefully toward the bracelet. "This man may have undergone specialized military conditioning. Certain medications could make this worse." The room went still again. Dr. Thalen stared at her. "Military conditioning?" "Yes. That's impossible to confirm." "I know," she answered quietly. "But I've seen reactions like this before." Delra stepped closer to Veyna. "What are you talking about?" Veyna opened her mouth but stopped herself. She already knew how this sounded. The younger nurse exchanged worried looks with another staff member. One of them whispered, "I think she's overwhelmed." The stress of the night had been brutal. Everyone knew Veyna had barely rested for days. Dr. Thalen lowered his voice carefully. "Veyna, step back for a moment." "But..." "Step back." She hesitated. The patient's monitor flashed another unstable warning. Something inside her screamed that they were running out of time. "I need to check his pupils again," she said quickly. "And his breathing intervals." Dr. Thalen looked irritated now. "We already checked them. Not the way they need to be checked." The room became awkwardly quiet. Delra touched Veyna's arm gently. "Maybe you should sit down for a minute." That sentence hit harder than expected. For the first time in years, Veyna saw doubt in the eyes around her. Not concern. Doubt. The younger in turn quietly whispered to another nurse. "She's cracking." Veyna heard it. Every word. But she said nothing. Outside, thunder rolled across the dark sky. Inside the trauma room, the machines continued their endless warning sounds, while the patient remained unconscious. Dr. Thalen resumed treatment quickly. "Continue protocol." Veyna stepped backward slowly, though her eyes never left the man on the bed. Then she noticed something else. A faint scar near the patient's neck. Not random. Precise. Old military insertion marking. Her stomach tightened instantly. This was no ordinary patient. She had seen those marks only once before during classified field training overseas. Back then, instructors warned that some operatives carried emergency procedures unknown to civilian hospitals. Very few medics were ever taught about them. Very few survived long enough to use them. Veyna suddenly felt cold despite the heated room. Delra noticed her pale expression. "Hey!" she said softly. "You need air." But Veyna barely heard her. Her memories kept pulling deeper. Locked rooms. Restricted manuals. One instructor saying quietly, "If this situation ever happens in civilian life, nobody will believe you." Back then, she thought she would never face it. Now the impossible was lying directly in front of her. The monitor beeped sharply again. The patient's condition dropped another level. Dr. Thalen looked frustrated. Why isn't he responding? Nobody answered. Veyna's hands slowly curled into fists at her sides. She knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough to understand the danger. Still, if she spoke further, she risked sounding completely unstable. The room already believed stress was affecting her judgment. Another nurse quietly guided her toward the hallway. "Come on, Veyna. Take a breather." She allowed herself to move a few steps away from the bed. But before reaching the doorway, she stopped. Her eyes returned one last time to the patient. Then, almost under her breath, she whispered words nobody fully understood. "They're going to lose him if they continue." Delra heard it and looked unsettled. "What did you say?" Veyna lifted her eyes slowly. For the first time that night, genuine fear appeared on her face. Not fear for herself. Fear for the unconscious stranger fighting for his life while nobody around him understood what was really happening. The hallway outside Trauma Room 2 felt colder than the rest of the hospital. Rain continued striking the windows while distant thunder rolled across the coast. Nurses hurried past carrying supplies, but near the trauma room door, the atmosphere felt heavy and tense. Veyna stood beside the wall with her arms folded tightly. She tried to steady her breathing, but her thoughts kept returning to the unconscious man inside. The bracelet, the scar near his neck, the strange reactions his body showed to the treatment. None of it felt accidental. Inside the room, monitor alarms continued rising and falling in uneven rhythms. Every sound tightened the pressure building in her chest. Delra stepped out quietly and shut the door halfway behind her. "You really scared them in there," she said carefully. Veyna rubbed her forehead. "I know. You challenged Thalen in the middle of a critical case. I wasn't trying to challenge him. Then what were you trying to do?" Veyna looked toward the small glass window in the trauma room door. Staff members moved quickly around the patient inside. "I think they're missing something important," she said softly. Delra sighed. "You've barely slept in days. Maybe your mind is connecting things that aren't there." Normally, Veyna would have accepted the concern quietly, but tonight something inside her refused to let go. "I know how this sounds," she replied, "but I've seen symptoms like his before." Delra crossed her arms. "During your military service?" Veyna hesitated. She almost never spoke about those years. Most people at the hospital assumed she had simply worked in combat medical camps overseas. Nobody knew much beyond that. "There were special training programs," Veyna said slowly. "Different emergency response methods." Delra gave a small, uncertain laugh. "You're talking like this man is some kind of secret operative." Veyna did not answer immediately. That silence worried Delra more than words would have. "Veyna," she whispered. "What exactly happened during those years?" Before Veyna could respond, the trauma room doors opened again. A younger nurse stepped out carrying empty packaging and shook her head. "He's getting worse," she muttered. The sentence hit Veyna hard. She turned immediately toward the room again. Dr. Thalen's voice could be heard inside giving rapid instructions. More equipment rolled across the floor. Someone requested additional medication from the pharmacy. Everything inside that room was escalating. Delra gently blocked Veyna's path before she could step back in. "Don't," she warned. Not right now. Veyna looked frustrated for the first time all night. They're treating him for the wrong condition. You don't know that. I do. You suspect it. Veyna lowered her eyes. Maybe Delra was right. Maybe exhaustion was affecting her judgment. The past few weeks had been brutal. Double shifts, emergency calls, endless stress. Her body felt drained. But deep down, another feeling kept pushing through the doubt. Instinct. The kind built through years of training where hesitation sometimes meant losing someone forever. Inside the room, the monitor suddenly released another sharp warning tone. A doctor cursed softly. Veyna closed her eyes for 1 second, and memories flooded back again. A cold underground classroom. Metal chairs. Military instructors standing beside projection screens filled with medical diagrams. One instructor speaking firmly. Some field agents undergo survival conditioning. Standard civilian responses may fail during collapse episodes. At the time, most trainees thought the information sounded unrealistic. Until they saw examples. Veyna remembered one training exercise clearly. A patient simulator had shown almost identical symptoms to the man now lying in trauma room 2. Erratic breathing, medication resistance, unstable cardiac rhythms that worsened under traditional treatment. Back then, she had asked why ordinary hospitals were not informed. The instructor's answer still echoed in her head. Because most people will never encounter it. She opened her eyes slowly, but she had encountered it now. A hospital orderly pushed a cart past them. Need this inside, he said quickly before disappearing through the trauma room doors. Delra studied Veyna's face more carefully. You really believe this is connected to your old training? Yes. And you think you know how to help him? Veyna swallowed quietly. Maybe. That's not enough certainty to interrupt an emergency team. I know. Delra softened her voice. Then why are you shaking? Veyna looked down at her hands. She had not even noticed. Years ago, during military work, she learned to hide fear better than almost anyone around her. But tonight felt different. Too many memories were resurfacing at once. And beneath all of it sat one terrible possibility. If she stayed silent and the patient died, she would never forgive herself. The trauma room doors suddenly burst open again. Dr. Thalen stepped into the hallway, pulling off one glove with visible frustration. He's not stabilizing, he muttered. 2 nurses followed him carrying fresh supplies. Thalen noticed Veyna immediately standing near the wall. His expression tightened slightly. You all right now? I'm fine. You didn't seem fine 10 minutes ago. Delra quickly stepped in. She's just overtired. Thalen looked unconvinced. We can't afford distractions tonight, he said carefully. Especially during critical treatment. Veyna nodded once. But before Thalen could return inside, she spoke again. The bracelet matters. He stopped walking. What? The bracelet on his wrist, she repeated. Please look at it closely. Thalen sighed heavily. Veyna, I'm serious. He stared at her for several long seconds. Then, more out of irritation than belief, he held out his hand. Fine. A nurse passed him the metal bracelet that had been removed earlier during treatment. Rainwater still clung to its surface. Thalen examined it briefly under the hallway lights. What exactly am I looking for? Turn it over. He did. The moment he saw the markings, his expression shifted slightly. Tiny engraved codes covered the inside surface. Not random numbers. Structured identification patterns. Delra leaned closer. What does that mean? Thalen frowned. Could be military. Veyna nodded immediately. It is. You can't know that for sure. I've seen the format before. Thalen handed the bracelet back with visible skepticism. Even if you're right, it changes nothing medically. It changes everything medically. The hallway fell quiet again. Delra looked nervous now. Veyna. But Veyna kept going. There are procedures civilian hospitals aren't trained for. Certain conditioned personnel react differently under stress collapse. Thalen stared at her like he was trying to decide whether she truly believed what she was saying. You're asking me to ignore established emergency protocol based on a theory? I'm asking you to slow down before making him worse. His jaw tightened. The younger nurse from earlier whispered something to another staff member nearby. Both glanced toward Veyna with worried expressions. The rumors were already spreading. People believed the pressure had finally gotten to her. Thalen lowered his voice carefully. You need to understand how this sounds. I do. You're talking about classified military medicine in the middle of a civilian emergency room. Because I think it's relevant. You think. Veyna looked directly at him. Please. Something in her tone made him pause. Not panic. Not arrogance. Desperation. For a brief moment, Thalen saw genuine conviction behind her exhaustion. Then another warning alarm sounded from inside the trauma room. One of the nurses rushed to the doorway. Doctor, we need you now. Thalen immediately turned back toward the room. Before entering, he looked once more at Veyna. Stay out here, he ordered. The doors closed behind him. Silence settled again in the hallway except for distant rain and muffled voices from nearby rooms. Delra exhaled slowly. You just challenged the head physician twice. Veyna leaned against the wall. I know. What if you're wrong? That question stayed hanging between them. Veyna had asked herself the same thing repeatedly over the last 20 minutes. What if exhaustion was twisting old memories into something impossible? What if fear and stress were making her reckless? But then she remembered the patient's breathing pattern again. The bracelet, the scar, the resistance to treatment. Too many details matched. Her eyes drifted toward the trauma room window once more. Inside, the patient's body remained completely still while doctors moved urgently around him. A strange sadness passed through her chest. Who was he? Why carry military identification with no personal documents? Why end up unconscious near the harbor during a storm? And most importantly, why did his condition match procedures buried in classified training manuals from years ago? Delra sat beside her on the hallway bench. You've never talked much about your service, she said quietly. There wasn't much to say. That's not true. Veyna remained silent. Delra studied her carefully. You still carry it with you every day, don't you? The question landed softly but painfully. Veyna looked down at the floor. There are things you don't really leave behind, she admitted. Before Delra could answer, the trauma room doors opened yet again. This time, the atmosphere changed instantly. One of the interns hurried out looking pale. Another nurse followed carrying empty medication trays. Something was going very wrong. Thalen stepped into the hallway again, tension covering his face. We're losing response completely, he admitted quietly. The words hit Veyna like ice. Delra looked alarmed. What happens now? Thalen rubbed both hands over his tired face. We continue. But his voice no longer sounded confident. For the first time that night, uncertainty had entered the room. And Veyna noticed it immediately. She stepped closer. There's another way, she said softly. Thalen looked at her again, longer this time. The hallway remained silent except for the distant storm outside. Then Veyna spoke words she had not said out loud in nearly a decade. I was trained for cases like this. The hallway became completely still after Veyna spoke those words. I was trained for cases like this. Dr. Thalen stared at her without blinking. For a moment, even the noise of the emergency room seemed distant. Rain tapped against the windows while the warning tones inside Trauma Room 2 continued rising and falling like an unstable heartbeat. Delra looked between them nervously. Veyna! But Veyna kept her eyes on Thalen. I know this sounds impossible, she said quietly, but I need you to trust me for a few minutes. Thalen crossed his arms tightly. Exhaustion showed clearly on his face now. You're asking me to risk a patient's life based on information nobody else here can confirm. He's already getting worse. That doesn't mean your theory is right. Veyna nodded once. I understand. The trauma room doors suddenly opened again. A nurse stepped out quickly. We're losing blood pressure again, she warned. Thalen closed his eyes briefly. When he looked back at Veyna, something in his expression had changed. Not belief exactly. more like desperation running out of options. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked carefully. Veyna took a slow breath. "There's a stabilization method," she said. "It's designed for patients whose nervous systems stop responding normally under extreme stress conditioning." Delra frowned. "Stress conditioning?" Veyna ignored the question for the moment. "It requires lowering external stimulation," she continued. "No aggressive medication pushes for a few minutes. Controlled breathing rhythm, temperature adjustment, specific pressure points to trigger response." The younger nurse nearby whispered, "That sounds insane." Veyna heard her but stayed focused on Thalen. "It's not random," she said softly. "I trained for this." Thalen rubbed his jaw. "And if you're wrong?" Veyna hesitated only a second. "Then you can remove me from the room immediately." The answer surprised him. She did not sound reckless. She sounded certain. Inside trauma room 2, another alarm echoed sharply. Thalen looked through the glass window at the unconscious man surrounded by machines and staff. Then he made a decision he clearly hated making. "5 minutes," he said quietly. Delra's eyes widened. "You can't be serious." "I said 5 minutes. Thalen pointed toward Veyna carefully. "If this fails, we return to standard procedure immediately." Veyna nodded. "Understood." The moment she stepped back into the trauma room, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Several nurses looked confused. One in turn looked openly uncomfortable. Dr. Thalen spoke firmly. "Everybody listen. We're trying a temporary stabilization adjustment." Nobody argued directly, but uncertainty spread across every face in the room. The patient remained motionless beneath the bright lights. His breathing had become dangerously uneven. Veyna moved toward the bedside slowly. For the first time in years, old instincts returned fully. Not hospital training, military training. Her voice became calm and precise. "Lower the room noise," she said. One nurse hesitated. "What?" "Turn off non-essential alerts." Thalen gave a reluctant nod. "Do it." The room suddenly felt quieter once several warning sounds disappeared. "Dim the overhead lights slightly." Another pause. Then someone adjusted them. The atmosphere changed immediately. Less harsh. Less chaotic. The younger in turn whispered under his breath, "What is this supposed to do?" Veyna ignored him. She gently touched 2 fingers near the patient's wrist, checking pulse rhythm differently than before. Still unstable, but not completely gone. "Has anyone checked his oxygen response during reduced stimulation?" she asked. Blank stares answered her. She expected that, because ordinary hospitals were never trained to look for it. Veyna leaned slightly closer to the patient. Her eyes studied every tiny movement of his face, chest, and breathing pattern. Then she noticed it again. The delayed inhale, exactly like before. Her heart pounded harder. She remembered another instructor from years ago saying quietly, "Their bodies sometimes react like they're still in survival mode long after danger has passed." At the time, the concept sounded unreal. Now it was unfolding directly in front of her. "Warm blankets," Veyna said suddenly. A nurse blinked. "His temperature's already elevated." "I know. Please." Thalen nodded once more. Blankets arrived quickly. Veyna adjusted them carefully across the patient's chest and shoulders. Her movements remained controlled, almost gentle. The room watched her silently now, not because they trusted her, because they could not understand what she was doing. Veyna leaned near the patient again. "Can you hear me?" she asked softly. No response, but she continued anyway. "You're safe now." The intern exchanged another uncertain look with a nurse. Delra stood near the doorway watching nervously. Veyna placed one hand lightly against the patient's shoulder while monitoring his breathing rhythm. Then she spoke quietly to Thalen. "I need 60 seconds without interruption." His face tightened. "That's dangerous. So is everything else we've tried." The room fell silent again. Finally, Thalen stepped backward slightly. 60 seconds, he agreed. Veyna closed her eyes briefly. Memory took over. A hidden medical training facility years earlier. A dim simulation room, instructors forcing trainees to repeat the same procedure over and over until it became instinct. Not because it was common, because if it was ever needed, hesitation could cost everything. She opened her eyes again. Then she began speaking softly to the unconscious man. Not loudly, not dramatically, calmly. Slow your breathing. The room watched in confusion. You're not in danger anymore. Nothing changed at first. The monitor continued its uneven pattern. One nurse shifted uncomfortably. Another looked at the clock as if waiting for permission to end this strange attempt. But Veyna stayed completely focused. Listen to my voice, she continued quietly. Stay with it. Her hand remained steady against his shoulder. Then something happened. Tiny, almost invisible. The patient's breathing paused differently. Not weaker, more controlled. Veyna noticed immediately. So did Thalen. What changed? He asked sharply. Nothing yet, she answered quickly. Wait. Everyone stared at the monitor. Another breath came, still uneven, but slightly stronger. The younger intern stepped closer. Was that random? Nobody answered him. Veyna adjusted the patient's head position slightly. Then she pressed 2 fingers carefully against a point near his collarbone. The intern frowned. What is that? A nerve response trigger, she said. You learned this where? Veyna did not answer. Her attention stayed fixed on the monitor. Another breath. Longer this time. The machine's warning tone softened slightly. Delra slowly moved closer to the bedside. Oh my God! Thalen stared at the screen carefully now. Blood pressure was still unstable, but no longer crashing. The room suddenly felt very different. Nobody whispered anymore. Nobody mocked the procedure now. They simply watched. Veyna continued speaking calmly to the unconscious man. Stay here, she said softly. You're all right. Another small shift appeared on the monitor. Then another. The intern shook his head slowly. That's impossible. But it was happening. Very slowly, the patient's breathing rhythm began stabilizing. Not fully, not safely yet, but enough to change the room's entire atmosphere. Thalen stepped closer beside Veyna. How are you doing this? Her eyes never left the patient. I told you, she whispered. I've seen this before. The patient suddenly twitched slightly beneath the blankets. Several nurses jumped. Easy, Veyna said immediately. She kept her voice low and steady. The monitor continued improving by tiny amounts. Each second now felt painfully long. Nobody wanted to interrupt whatever was happening. Rain hammered harder against the hospital windows outside. Inside the trauma room, every person stood frozen around the bed. The patient's fingers moved faintly. Delra covered her mouth with one hand. He's responding, she whispered. Thalen checked the readings again in disbelief. This doesn't make sense. But Veyna understood exactly why it made sense. The body was no longer fighting the treatment. It was finally recognizing safety. One of the nurses quietly asked, "What kind of military training teaches this?" Still, Veyna did not answer, because the truth sounded too strange even now. The patient's breathing steadied again. Then suddenly, the monitor gave one sharp warning pulse. Everyone froze. The patient's body stiffened briefly before going still again. The room's fragile hope shattered instantly. Vitals dropping again, the intern warned. Thalen moved forward immediately. We're losing him. Panic threatened to return to the room. But Veyna raised her voice sharply for the first time all night. No. Everyone stopped. She stepped closer to the patient again, studying him intensely. Then her eyes widened slightly. It's happening exactly like before, she whispered. Thalen looked frustrated. What does that mean? Veyna swallowed hard. During training, there had always been one dangerous stage. A moment where the body resisted recovery one final time. Most people failed there, unless the medic knew what came next. She looked at the patient's bracelet again lying on the nearby tray, then back at the scar near his neck. The pieces finally connected in her mind. This man had not simply received special training. He had survived something much deeper. something classified far beyond ordinary military medicine. Fear crept quietly into Veyna's chest, because suddenly she realized why his condition looked so familiar. Not from training simulations. From one real case years ago overseas. A case she was ordered never to discuss again. The monitor beeped unevenly once more. The room waited for instructions. And Veyna understood that the next decision she made could either save him, or expose secrets she had spent years trying to forget. The trauma room felt even smaller after Veyna's realization. The monitors kept beeping in uneven patterns, but now the sound no longer felt like background noise. Felt like pressure. Every doctor and nurse in the room waited without speaking, watching the patient's unstable condition shift again. Veyna stood very still beside the bed. Her eyes were fixed on the man's face, but her thoughts were far away for a moment. Something deep in her memory had finally connected the pieces she had been trying to ignore. This was not just a medical emergency. It was something she had seen once before, years ago, in a place she was never supposed to talk about. Behind her, Dr. Thalen's voice broke the silence. "We're losing the rhythm again," he said sharply. "We need to act now." A nurse quickly checked the readings. Blood pressure dropping. Oxygen levels unstable. Delra stood near the corner of the room, watching Veyna carefully. She could see that something had changed in her expression. It was no longer doubt or confusion. It was recognition mixed with something heavier. "Veyna," Delra said quietly. "What is it?" Veyna did not answer immediately. Her eyes stayed on the patient's wrist, where the bracelet had been placed on a tray. The engraved codes still caught the light in a strange way, like they carried meaning most people were never meant to understand. Finally, she spoke in a low voice. "I know what this is," she said. Dr. Thalen turned toward her immediately. "Then explain it clearly." Veyna hesitated for only a second. Then she exhaled slowly. "This is not a normal collapse condition," she said. "It's a controlled physiological response pattern. It happens in individuals who went through advanced survival conditioning programs." The room went quiet again. One of the younger nurses frowned. "Survival conditioning?" Thalen narrowed his eyes. "That sounds like military terminology." "It is," Veyna said. Delra stepped closer, concern growing in her voice. "But that doesn't help us right now. We need medical solutions, not theories." Veyna nodded slightly, but her focus remained steady. "This is medical," she said. "Just not standard medical." She pointed gently toward the patient's chest. "His body is reacting like it's still in a controlled training state. His nervous system is rejecting normal intervention because it interprets it as overload." The intern looked confused. "That's not possible." Veyna turned toward him. "It is possible. I've seen it before." Dr. Thalen rubbed his forehead. "Even if what you're saying is true, how do we treat it?" Veyna paused again. This was the part she had been avoiding since she walked into the hospital that night. Because what came next was not something she was supposed to reveal. Not to civilian doctors. Not to anyone. But the patient's condition was worsening again. A monitor beeped sharply. Time was running out. Veyna stepped closer to the bed. "There is a stabilization sequence," she said quietly. Thalen looked at her sharply. "Sequence?" "Yes." "Explain." Veyna swallowed. "It's a structured reset protocol. It calms the nervous system by controlling external stimuli and guiding internal rhythm regulation. It was used in field situations where normal emergency care failed." Delra looked stunned. "You're talking about something secret?" Veyna did not confirm or deny it directly, but her silence said enough. Thalen stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the patient. "He's not responding to anything else," he muttered. Another alarm sounded. The situation was slipping again. Finally, Thalen made a decision. "Do it," he said. The room reacted immediately. One nurse blinked. "Doctor, we don't know." "I said do it," Thalen repeated firmly. The staff fell silent again. All eyes returned to Veyna. She nodded once. "Thank you," she said softly. Delra stepped closer. "Veyna, are you sure about this?" Veyna did not answer directly. Instead, she moved back to the bedside and adjusted her position beside the patient. The room felt tense again, but now there was a different kind of silence. Not disbelief, not judgment, expectation. Veyna placed her hand lightly near the patient's shoulder. Her voice softened. "Everyone reduce unnecessary movement," she instructed. The nurses hesitated but obeyed. "Lower the alarm volume again." Another pause, then compliance. "Dim the lights further." The room became calmer, almost dim and quiet. The patient's breathing was still unstable, but less chaotic than before. Veyna leaned closer. "You're going to follow a rhythm now," she said softly. The intern whispered to Delra. "Is she talking to him like he can hear her?" Delra did not answer, because something unusual was happening. The patient's breathing shifted slightly again. Very small, but noticeable. Veyna continued in a calm, steady tone. No resistance, just rhythm. The monitor flickered, then stabilized for a moment. Thalen stepped closer, watching carefully. "What is that doing?" "His nervous system is responding," Veyna said quietly. She adjusted the patient's position slightly, aligning his breathing posture. Then she did something that surprised everyone. She placed 2 fingers near a point along his wrist and applied gentle pressure. The intern frowned. "That's not standard procedure." "It's not standard medicine," Veyna replied. Delra looked increasingly worried. "Where did you learn this?" Veyna hesitated. For a brief second, she almost stopped. But the patient's condition forced her forward. "I learned it during specialized field training," she said finally. Thalen looked at her closely. "Who trained you?" Veyna did not answer that question. Instead, she focused on the patient again. "Stay with the rhythm," she said softly. For several seconds, nothing changed. Then the monitor showed a slight improvement. One nurse gasped quietly. "It's stabilizing a bit," she said. Thalen checked the readings. His expression changed slowly from skepticism to confusion. "This shouldn't be happening," he muttered. But it was. Very slowly, the patient's breathing became more controlled. Not fully stable, but no longer collapsing. Veyna kept her voice steady. "You're safe," she repeated. The patient's fingers twitched faintly. Delra covered her mouth in shock. "Oh my God!" Thalen stepped back slightly. "This is unreal." But Veyna knew it was not unreal. It was controlled and fragile. Suddenly, the monitor beeped sharply again. The improvement stopped. The patient's condition dropped slightly. A nurse tensed immediately. "We're losing it again." Thalen prepared to intervene. "We need medication." "No," Veyna said firmly. Everyone froze. Her tone was different now. More urgent. "Not yet," she added. Thalen stared at her. "Why?" Veyna looked at the patient carefully. Because now she understood something else. This stage always happened. The final resistance point. If handled incorrectly, the system would shut down completely. She leaned closer again and spoke softly. "You're not in that environment anymore," she said. Her voice remained calm, but stronger now. "You don't need to hold that state." The room watched silently. The patient's breathing paused, then shifted again. This time deeper, more natural. The monitor flickered once more, then slowly began improving again. Delra's eyes filled with disbelief. "It's working." Thalen said nothing, but his expression had completely changed now. He was no longer doubtful. He was observing, trying to understand something beyond his experience. The patient's oxygen levels rose slightly. Blood pressure stabilized a little more. Not fully normal, but no longer critical. Veyna did not relax. She kept her hand steady and her voice calm. "Stay here," she said again. Another small improvement appeared. The room remained completely silent. Even the interns who had doubted her earlier now watched without speaking. Something had shifted in the room. Not just the patient, but the way everyone looked at Veyna. She was no longer just a tired nurse. She was something else. Someone with knowledge they did not understand. Minutes passed slowly. The patient's condition continued to stabilize in small increments. Finally, Thalen spoke quietly. If this continues, we may avoid full cardiac failure. No one responded, because they were all watching the monitor. And watching Veyna. Delra stepped closer, voice soft. You really knew what to do. Veyna did not look away from the patient. I hoped I did, she replied quietly. But deep inside, she felt something heavier. Because this was not the end of it. The bracelet, the markings, the scar. None of that had been explained yet. And the biggest question still remained unanswered. Who exactly was the man lying in front of her? And why had a classified procedure been the only thing keeping him alive? The rain outside finally began to slow, but inside the hospital, the tension had not disappeared. It still hung in the air like something heavy that no one could remove. The trauma room was quieter now, but nobody in it looked relaxed. The patient was still unconscious, but his condition had stabilized enough that the alarms were no longer screaming every few seconds. The monitors showed a slow, steady rhythm returning, even if it was fragile. Nurses moved carefully around the bed, as if even loud breathing might disturb the balance Veyna had managed to create. Veyna stood at the side of the room, her hands still slightly tense. She had not stepped back fully. Her eyes remained fixed on the patient, watching every small change on the monitor. Even though the worst danger had passed for now, she did not trust the situation completely. Dr. Thalen leaned over the chart, reviewing the latest readings. His face showed something between exhaustion and disbelief. He had been in medicine for years, seen countless emergencies, but what had happened in the last hour did not fit into anything he understood. Delra stood near Veyna quietly. She kept glancing between Veyna and the patient, still trying to process everything she had witnessed. The calm, focused nurse she thought she knew now seemed like someone carrying a much heavier past than anyone had guessed. The trauma room door opened gently, and a staff nurse stepped out to inform them that the patient had been moved to a more stable monitoring state. The immediate emergency was over, but no one celebrated. Felt too fragile for that. Thalen finally removed his gloves and exhaled deeply. He's stable for now, he said, almost like he was not fully convinced by his own words. A junior nurse responded softly. We didn't think he would survive that drop. No one answered her. The truth was already understood. Thalen turned toward Veyna. His expression had changed compared to earlier. The frustration was gone. What remained was curiosity, mixed with something closer to respect. You said you were trained for this, he said quietly. Veyna nodded once. Where? He asked. A silence followed. Not an angry one, just careful. Delra looked at Veyna, sensing that whatever came next would not be simple. Veyna hesitated. She had avoided this moment for years. Every time she had been asked about her past, she had chosen silence because silence felt safer. But tonight, silence was no longer an option. It wasn't a regular medical program, she finally said. Thalen folded his arms. Explain. Veyna looked toward the patient for a brief second before speaking again. I worked in a classified military medical unit, she said quietly. We were trained for cases where normal emergency systems failed completely. A few staff members exchanged glances. The word classified immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. Delra whispered, You never told anyone that. Veyna did not respond to her directly. Thalen's voice lowered. And you're saying this patient is connected to that? I don't know his full identity, Veyna admitted, but his condition matches patterns we were trained to recognize. One of the nurses frowned. So he's military? Possibly, Veyna said carefully. Or he was part of something similar. Thalen looked back at the patient again, thinking, The bracelet. Veyna nodded. It's not a hospital ID, and it's not standard military identification either. Delra stepped closer, her voice soft. Then what is it? Veyna took a slow breath. An operational tag, she said, used in restricted programs where identity is coded instead of written. The room became silent again. The idea sounded unreal to most of them. Something out of a story, not a hospital in the middle of a stormy night. Thalen rubbed his forehead. If what you're saying is true, then why is someone like that here unconscious without support? Veyna shook her head slightly. That's what I don't understand yet. She looked down for a moment, her expression tightening. But I've seen cases like this before, she added quietly. And they never end up here by accident. Delra studied her face carefully. What happened in those other cases? Veyna hesitated again. Her voice dropped lower. Most of them never reached hospitals like this, she said. Because by the time they did, it was already too late. That sentence made the room feel colder. No one spoke for a few seconds. The patient's monitor beeped steadily in the background. A reminder that at least for now, he was still alive. Thalen finally broke the silence. You used a procedure on him tonight that none of us recognized. Yes, it worked. Veyna did not react to the praise. It only worked because we caught him in time. A nurse quietly asked, So what happens next? Thalen looked at the chart again. We monitor him closely. If he remains stable, we transfer him to recovery. But Veyna shook her head slightly. That's not enough, she said. Everyone turned to her again. Delra frowned. What do you mean? Veyna stepped closer to the bed. Her voice stayed calm, but there was something serious behind it. If I'm right about his background, she said, then his condition could relapse without warning. Thalen looked concerned now. Relapse into what? System collapse response, Veyna answered. It's rare, but it happens when the body doesn't fully reset from conditioning. The intern looked confused. So he could crash again? Yes, Veyna said simply. Silence followed again. Thalen looked at her for a long moment. You're asking for continued intervention based on military theory we can't verify. I'm asking you not to discharge him from close observation too quickly, she corrected. Delra stepped in. She's not trying to take control, she said gently. She's trying to prevent another emergency. Thalen did not answer immediately. He looked back at the patient, then at the team around him. Finally, he spoke. We keep him under observation, he said. Extended monitoring. No discharge decisions yet. Relief passed quietly through the room, though no one showed it openly. Veyna gave a small nod. Thank you, she said softly, but she did not relax. Because even though the immediate danger had passed, her mind was still stuck on something else. The bracelet. She walked toward the tray where it had been placed. Delra followed her quietly. You keep looking at that thing, Delra said. Veyna picked it up carefully, turning it in her hands. The codes on it are incomplete, she said. What does that mean? It means it was separated from its original system, Veyna replied. Like part of something larger. Delra frowned. And that matters? Yes, Veyna said. Because it means someone else is probably looking for him. That statement changed Delra's expression immediately. Looking for him? She repeated. Veyna nodded slowly. If he belonged to the program, I think he did. Then he doesn't just disappear without consequences. A heavy silence followed. In the background, the patient moved slightly for the first time in hours. A small shift of his fingers. Weak but real. A nurse noticed immediately. He moved. Thalen stepped closer. That's a good sign. But Veyna did not look reassured. Instead, she placed the bracelet back down carefully. Her instincts were not calm. They were alert, because movement did not always mean recovery. Sometimes it meant transition. Delra noticed her expression. What are you thinking? Veyna kept her voice low. I'm thinking this isn't over, she said. The hours slowly passed after that. The hospital began to settle back into its normal rhythm. Emergency cases decreased as the storm outside weakened. The staff moved between rooms with less urgency now, though the memory of the night still lingered in their expressions. But in the recovery unit, everything remained focused on one patient. He was finally stable enough to be monitored without constant intervention. Machines still surrounded him, but their alarms were quiet now. Only soft, steady beeping filled the room. Veyna stood outside the glass window for a long time. Delra came beside her again. You should rest, Delra said. I will, Veyna replied, but she did not move. Delra studied her carefully. You saved him tonight. Veyna shook her head slightly. I delayed the worst outcome. That's still saving him. Veyna did not answer. Her eyes remained fixed on the unconscious man. After a long pause, she spoke quietly. I think he was running from something, she said. Delra frowned. What makes you say that? Veyna looked at her briefly. People don't end up with those markings unless they've lived through things they can't explain. Delra did not respond. Inside the room, the patient's breathing remained steady. But Veyna could not shake the feeling that what had brought him here was not finished. Somewhere beyond the hospital walls, there might be questions waiting. And answers that were never meant to surface in a place like this.